The pewter clouds hung low over St. Michael's Church, their somber presence a fitting backdrop to the day's proceedings. The ancient stone building stood sentinel against the autumn wind, its weathered facade bearing witness to countless ceremonies of joy and sorrow throughout the generations. Today, however, the air was thick with an unusually heavy grief as the village gathered to bid farewell to Hannah Morrison. The church bells tolled with a mournful resonance that seemed to pierce the very soul of every mourner present. Their deep, bronzed notes carried across the village square, drawing the last stragglers from their homes and businesses. The sound echoed off the cobblestones, each toll a reminder of the void left by Hannah's passing. Inside the church, the wooden pews creaked beneath the weight of the assembled villagers. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and beeswax, mingling with the musty odor of old hymnals and ancient stone. Shafts of filtered light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the mourners' faces, each lost in their own private remembrance of the woman they had come to honor. Martha Wilkins, the village baker, dabbed at her eyes with a flour-dusted handkerchief, remembering how Hannah would stop by every morning for fresh bread and a chat that often stretched well past the breakfast hour. 2 pews behind her, old Thomas Green stared straight ahead, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap, recalling how Hannah had tended to his wife during her final days, bringing soup and comfort in equal measure. The casket rested at the front of the church, its polished oak surface adorned with a spray of white roses and forget-me-nots, Hannah's favorites. The flowers seemed to glow against the dark wood, their delicate petals trembling in the draft that whispered through the ancient building. Father Michael stood beside it, his usually confident demeanor somewhat subdued, fingers fidgeting with the edges of his prayer book. It was then that Duke, Hannah's faithful black Labrador, broke the reverent silence. His initial whimper drew little attention. After all, who could fault a dog for mourning his mistress? But when the whimper transformed into a series of sharp, insistent barks, heads began to turn. Duke stood rigid in the center aisle, his dark eyes fixed on the casket, hackles raised in an unmistakable display of agitation. "Hush now, boy," whispered Sarah Cooper, who had taken temporary custody of Duke following Hannah's death. She tugged gently at his leash, but Duke remained unmoved, his barking growing more urgent with each passing moment. The dog's distress seemed to ripple through the congregation, creating an undercurrent of unease that disturbed the solemn atmosphere. Father Michael cleared his throat, attempting to redirect attention back to the service. "Let us bow our heads in prayer," he began, his voice carrying a slight tremor that seemed out of place for a man who had conducted countless funerals over the years. But Duke's barking only intensified, drowning out the priest's words. Among the mourners sat David Matthews, a relative newcomer to the village who had moved in just 6 months ago to take over the local bookshop. He watched the unfolding scene with growing interest, his journalist's instincts, honed during years of investigative reporting in London, stirring to life. Something about Duke's behavior struck him as more than mere grief. The dog wasn't simply howling in distress. He was trying to communicate something specific, his attention laser-focused on the casket. David observed how Father Michael's face had grown increasingly pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the church's cool interior. The priest's hands trembled as he gripped the podium, his knuckles white with tension. It seemed an excessive reaction to a dog's disruption, no matter how inappropriate the timing. The villagers exchanged uncertain glances, their discomfort growing with each passing moment. Some shifted in their seats, while others whispered behind raised hands, the sacred silence of the funeral giving way to a low murmur of concern. Sarah made another attempt to quiet Duke, but the dog remained steadfast in his vigil, his barks echoing off the vaulted ceiling with an almost accusatory tone. Through the stained glass windows, the weather seemed to mirror the growing tension inside. The wind had picked up, causing the ancient yew trees in the churchyard to sway and creak, their shadows dancing across the stone floor like restless spirits. A distant rumble of thunder added its voice to Duke's protests, as if nature itself was joining in the dog's mysterious objection. David's eyes narrowed as he noticed Father Michael step away from the casket, his movements almost imperceptible but telling. The priest's reaction seemed disproportionate, his discomfort more aligned with guilt than mere annoyance at the disruption. David had covered enough stories in his career to recognize when someone was hiding something, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that there was more to this scenario than met the eye. As the chaos continued to unfold, David found himself studying the faces around him, noting the varying degrees of confusion and concern. Most seemed genuinely puzzled by Duke's behavior, but a few, particularly those closest to Hannah, appeared to be processing the scene with a different kind of awareness, as if the dog's actions were confirming long-held suspicions. The funeral director stepped forward, clearly uncertain how to proceed with the service. The traditional rhythm of the ceremony had been completely disrupted, leaving everyone in an uncomfortable limbo between proper mourning and unexplained tension. The air in the church grew thicker with each passing moment, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching storm outside. David's attention was drawn to a slight movement in his peripheral vision. An elderly woman in the front pew, he recognized her as Mrs. Patterson, Hannah's next-door neighbor, was slowly shaking her head, her lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. But there was something about her expression that suggested she was processing more than grief. Her eyes darted between Duke and Father Michael with a knowing look that spoke of buried secrets and unspoken truths. The disruption had transformed what should have been a somber farewell into something entirely different. As David watched Duke continue his vigil, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing the beginning of something significant. The dog's behavior wasn't just an expression of grief. It was a catalyst, setting in motion events that would soon unravel the carefully maintained facade of village life. Thunder rolled again, closer now, and a flash of lightning illuminated the church interior through the stained glass windows. In that brief, brilliant moment, David caught a glimpse of Father Michael's face, and what he saw there confirmed his growing suspicions. The priest's expression wasn't just one of discomfort or annoyance. It was fear, raw and unmistakable, flashing across his features like the lightning outside. As the service ground to an awkward halt, with Duke's barking showing no signs of subsiding, David made a mental note to pay closer attention to the village dynamics in the coming days. His years as a journalist had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that Hannah Morrison's funeral was just the beginning of a much larger story. The villagers began to stir, uncertain whether to remain seated or begin filing out. The carefully choreographed ritual of saying goodbye had been transformed into something else entirely, something that felt more like a prelude than a conclusion. As David watched Father Michael retreat to the vestry, his steps just a little too hurried to be casual. He knew that his quiet semi-retirement in the village was about to become considerably more interesting. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain beginning to drum against the ancient windows. The sound provided a rhythmic counterpoint to Duke's continuing protests, nature's percussion accompanying what felt increasingly like an overture to a much larger drama. David settled back in his pew, his mind already beginning to piece together the puzzle that Hannah's death, and Duke's reaction to it, presented. Something told him that the real story was just beginning to unfold. The rain's intensity increased, transforming the church windows into cascading sheets of water that distorted the world beyond. David watched as individual droplets traced intricate patterns down the ancient glass, each one seeming to write its own mysterious message. The storm had effectively trapped the congregation inside, creating an unexpectedly intimate atmosphere that only heightened the tension sparked by Duke's continued vigilance. Mrs. Patterson's arthritic hands clutched her worn prayer book more tightly, her knuckles white with either tension or knowledge. David couldn't be sure which. She caught his observant gaze and quickly looked away, but not before he noticed the slight tremor in her lower lip, a telltale sign of someone struggling to contain information that demanded to be released. The funeral director, a thin man named Harrison whose suit seemed a size too large for his frame, made several unsuccessful attempts to restore order. His practiced professional demeanor cracked slightly as he realized the futility of his efforts. Duke had positioned himself directly between the casket and the vestry door, where Father Michael had disappeared, his posture rigid and alert, like a guardian preventing escape rather than a mourning pet. Sarah Cooper had given up trying to control Duke, letting his leash go slack in her hands. Her face showed the confusion of someone who had known both Hannah and her dog for years, yet had never seen behavior like this from either. "He's always been such a gentle soul," she whispered to no one in particular, her words nearly lost in the sound of rain and thunder. The medieval church's architecture seemed to amplify every sound, from the persistent drumming of rain on the roof to the uncomfortable shuffling of feet against ancient stone floors. The storm's natural symphony created an almost theatrical backdrop to the drama unfolding within the sacred space. Lightning flickered through the stained glass, casting ever-changing shadows that danced across the walls like ethereal spectators to the scene below. David's journalistic instincts had fully awakened now, his mind cataloging every detail with professional precision. He noticed how the younger villagers looked to their elders for cues on how to react, while the older generation seemed divided between those genuinely puzzled and others who appeared to be struggling with some burden of knowledge. The social dynamics of the small village were revealing themselves in subtle ways that might have gone unnoticed under normal circumstances. Moving carefully to avoid drawing attention to himself, David shifted to a position where he could better observe both the vestry door and the reactions of those nearest to it. The heavy oak door remained firmly closed, but he could have sworn he heard movement behind it. The rustle of fabric, perhaps, or the sound of papers being hastily sorted. A particularly loud crack of thunder made several mourners jump, and in that moment of distraction, David noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Through the gap beneath the vestry door, a shadow moved in a way that suggested someone was pacing rapidly back and forth. The movement spoke of agitation, of someone trying to decide between fight and flight. The atmosphere in the church had transformed completely from its initial solemnity. What had begun as a funeral had morphed into meeting else entirely. Part mystery, part confrontation, with the deceased somehow still at the center of it all. The white roses on Hannah's casket trembled with each of Duke's barks, their petals occasionally drifting to the floor like silent tears. Thomas Green, who had remained stoically silent throughout the disruption, suddenly stood up. His movement drew all eyes, the collective attention of the congregation, shifting from Duke to the elderly farmer who had lived in the village longer than most had been alive. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in a momentary lull in both the storm and Duke's barking. "There's something not right here," he announced, his Yorkshire accent thick with emotion. "Hannah wouldn't have wanted this. She wouldn't have wanted—" He trailed off, seeming to catch himself before saying more, but his words hung in the air like smoke, adding another layer of mystery to the already charged atmosphere. Mrs. Patterson reached out and tugged at Thomas's sleeve, trying to pull him back into his seat, but he remained standing. The exchange between them, though silent, spoke volumes to David's trained eye. These people knew something about Hannah, about Father Michael, about the circumstances that had led to this moment. The storm's fury seemed to increase, as if nature itself was demanding that the truth be revealed. Wind howled through some unseen gap in the ancient stonework, creating an eerie whistling that sounded almost like a distant voice. Several of the older villagers crossed themselves, their ingrained superstitions rising to the surface in response to the increasingly strange atmosphere. David noticed that Duke's barking had changed subtly. The dog's protests now seemed more focused, more purposeful, as if he was trying to direct attention to something specific. His gaze remained fixed on the casket, but there was an intelligence in his eyes that suggested more than simple grief or agitation. The funeral director made one last attempt to salvage the situation, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Perhaps we should consider postponing the remainder of the service," he suggested, his professional veneer cracking further as another rumble of thunder emphasized his words. "Until the weather improves, and we can ensure a more appropriate atmosphere." But his words were cut short by a sound that made everyone freeze. A metallic clatter from within the vestry, followed by what was unmistakably a muffled curse in Father Michael's voice. Duke's barking reached a new intensity, and several people gasped as the dog lunged toward the vestry door, pulling the leash from Sarah's startled grip. The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. David found himself on his feet, though he couldn't remember deciding to stand. The vestry door shuddered, as if someone had backed into it from the other side. Duke positioned himself in front of it, his barking now interspersed with low growls that spoke of protection rather than aggression. Through the windows, David could see that the storm had drawn more curious onlookers to the church grounds. Faces peered in through the glass, distorted by rain and centuries-old imperfections in the panes, adding to the surreal quality of the scene. The village was bearing witness to something unprecedented, though none could yet say exactly what that something was. Mrs. Patterson had begun to weep silently, her tears falling onto the pages of her prayer book, making the ink run in tiny rivers that seemed to mirror the rain outside. Thomas Green placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but his own expression was one of grim determination rather than consolation. The atmosphere in the church had become almost unbearable, charged with a combination of tension, fear, and the growing certainty that something momentous was about to happen. The storm raged on, its fury matching the emotional tempest building within the sacred walls. While Hannah's casket remained at the center of it all, its presence both passive and somehow accusatory. David's mind raced through possible scenarios, his years of investigative work providing framework after framework for what might be unfolding. But this was different from his previous cases in the city. This was personal, intimate, a small community on the verge of having its secrets exposed, with consequences that would inevitably reshape relationships that had been decades in the making. A flash of lightning illuminated the church interior with brilliant clarity, and in that instant, David saw something that made his breath catch. Through the gap beneath the vestry door, a small object had appeared, a corner of what looked like an envelope, pushed out accidentally perhaps, or dropped in haste. The paper was old, yellowed with age, but he could make out what appeared to be Hannah's distinctive handwriting on the visible portion. The storm's fury reached its peak, rain hammering against the roof with such force that it sounded like 1,000 drummers unleashing their fury on the ancient tiles. The sound was nearly deafening, yet somehow Duke's barking cut through it all, steady and insistent, a canine chorus demanding that truth prevail over secrets. David began to move toward the envelope, his steps measured and deliberate. He could feel the eyes of the congregation following him, some understanding dawning in their collective consciousness that this moment, this strange, storm-wrapped moment in their village church, was the beginning of something that would change them all forever. The weight of history pressed down on the scene, generations of village life, and secrets accumulated like the layers of paint on the church walls. As David reached for the envelope, thunder rolled overhead like the voice of judgment itself, and he knew with absolute certainty that Hannah's funeral was not an ending, but a beginning, the first chapter in a story that had waited far too long to be told.